Well, she was standing at the edge of the platform, and she was scared. She was thinking, why did I agree to this? She was thinking, why did I think this would be fun? You see, she was all geared up and ready to bungee jump off a bridge. And she was there now, and she is like, I don't want to do this. She was scared. Now, this kind of scenario happens quite often, because I've seen lots of videos of people standing on the edge. But it plays out in different ways. One way is that the person chickens out and walks away. Another way is that they stand there long enough that the workers count down 3, 2, 1, and if the person doesn't move, they push. Another is the person jumps, but then right after they jump, they change their mind and start turning and trying to grab a hold of the platform again, but they fall anyways. Another is the person jumps and finds it's exhilarating and terrifying and says, I will never do that again. Or the person jumps and just has a great time and said, I had nothing to fear. Well, in life, there are things that scare us. And sometimes it's for good reason. But lately, I've found that there are a lot of people who are just fearful. There's a lot of scared people in our world, and even in the church. In fact, there are many songs that have been written for worship that are about fear and how God helps us. But sometimes being scared is understandable, but sometimes it's not. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is, if God has made you a promise about something, or told us that we don't need to fear something, then we shouldn't be afraid. And if we are, then we need to, what do? We turn to Him, we lean on Him, we don't worry, but we trust the Lord. In our passage today, God sends Isaiah with a message of God's protection, but, well, you'll see what happens. Look at chapter 7 and verse 1. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 1, it says, In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. So this verse gives us the historical setting for this message, this prophetic message from God through Isaiah. So let me fill in the background for you. Last week we mentioned Uzziah, King Uzziah. And we talked a little bit about him. Well, now his grandson, Ahaz, is king in Judah. So this is, several years later. And so Ahaz was not a good king. And what I mean by that is he was not godly. He did not follow God. He was not faithful to God. In fact, he was a totally unashamed idol worshiper. And so during this period of time, Assyria, the big one from the farther away, Assyria was growing in strength and expanding their empire. And they had even pushed down into the Philistine territory, taking some area down by the Mediterranean Sea, along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. So they're right next to Israel. So the king of Israel and the king of Syria, they formed an alliance together to stand against the advances of Assyria. And they wanted Judah to join them as well. And even though they had tried to convince Judah to join them, both Ahaz and his father had refused to do so. But here's the reason why. You might think it's because they're being faithful to God or something, but really the reason why is because they're more afraid of the Assyrians than they are of Israel and Syria. And so they have refused to do it. And they think they're better off if they submit to Assyria or the king of Assyria and ask him, trust him to protect them. And so the thinking is, well, we might lose a little freedom or we might lose a little wealth, but we'll save our lives. So now, at this point, Israel and Syria decide to force Judah to join them by war or through war. So they're going to come down and attack Judah. And they have this plan to remove Ahaz as king and to set up their own puppet king who will do what they want. And so up to this point, both Israel and Syria have independently won significant battles against Judah. But they have not been able to take the capital city of Jerusalem. Okay, so now we're up to speed. This is where we're at. Verse 2 says, when the house of David was told, Syria is in league with Ephraim, which another name for Israel, the northern kingdom, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as trees of the forest shake before the wind. So someone tells Ahaz and his relatives that Israel and Syria have teamed up, and he is scared. I mean, he is extremely scared, he and his relatives. In fact, they are pictured here like leaves that are being, leaves on a tree that are being blown in the wind, and they're just trembling in that wind. So here the people, Ahaz and his relatives, they are trembling with fear at this message. But notice one other thing. Ahaz here and his family are called House of David. Now, most of the time you would just refer to the king as the king. You would just name the king. But here, they are called the House of David. Isaiah is drawing attention to the fact that they are part of David's dynasty. Well, when we hear that, it brings to mind a few things. It brings to mind things like the fact that God made a promise to David and to his descendants. It reminds us that they were to be ruling the people of Judah and ultimately Israel, all of Israel. But it also reminds us that they were to be faithful to God. And it reminds us that God said, he said to David, if your son is not, I will discipline him like a son. So he will discipline David's descendants when they are not faithful. But having said all that, that makes you wonder, what's going to happen here? And what's going to happen with David's line? Because things are not right in David's line right now. His descendants are not being faithful to God. Verse 3 says, and the Lord said to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, that's his name, Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field, and say to him, be careful, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands, at the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah. Because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah, that's the king of Israel, has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. So God sends Isaiah with this message for the king, and he tells him to take his son along. Now, he doesn't go into it here, but Isaiah's kids, they were all given names that had specific meanings. And this son here, his name actually means a remnant will return. And so Isaiah is probably taking his son along as part of the message, as part of the encouraging message from God. But they go out and they're to meet the king at one of the water pools. The king is expecting an attack to come. And so he's out there preparing his defenses and checking on his water sources. One of the big things back then is you would take and you would siege a city so they would run out of food and water and give up. So he's making sure he has water and all his defenses and water are in place. Remember, he's scared. And so Isaiah is going to come and he is going to interrupt the king's worry with a message. God gives an encouraging message to the king. He says, this attack that is coming will fail. He says, it will fail. He says that tells him that the king of Israel and the king of Syria, they aren't that great. He compares them to like smoldering sticks that are about to burn out. So they can't do too much damage. And God will bring an end to both of them. So he says they have this plan, but it will not come to pass. God won't let it. These kings and their capitals are nothing compared to God. And the northern king of Israel soon won't even be a nation any longer. And so he gives this message of encouragement for a scared king. There's a promise of deliverance. But this message begins and ends with a challenge. So first, let's look at the beginning. In verse 4, he has 4 commands there. The first one is, be careful. Now, this tells the king that he needs to think well and make right choices. You remember, I just mentioned he is what? An idolater. He hasn't been making good choices. He's not following God. He's not believing in God, worshiping God. He's worshiping a false God. And so he hasn't been making good choices. He's not listening to God. So God, the very first thing he tells him is, be careful. Think well. Make good choices. Secondly, he tells him, be quiet. Now, this tells the king to relax and be calm. In other words, he's not saying be quiet and as in don't say anything. He's saying be calm. In other words, don't worry. Thirdly, he says do not fear. Now this is pretty clear. He's saying you don't need to be afraid. And fourthly, he says do not let your heart be faint. Don't lose heart. Don't be discouraged. Don't be distraught. And so he gives him these 4 commands right at the beginning, this challenge to him to have faith. Well, then we come to the end, and he gives him another challenge. He says, if you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. He's telling him, you must have faith. You must have faith, or things will not end well. Now, here's the problem. Again, Ahaz is an idolater. He's not like his ancestor David. He hasn't put his trust in God like David did. And he also already has plans to pay off the king of Assyria to come down and protect him. He's put his trust in a man. And the thing is God knows all this. So he says, be careful. Think carefully about what you're going to do. He says, be careful. And he challenges Ahaz to trust God, to trust him. God made a promise to save him. Ahaz needs to believe and stand firm in faith. Now, in that sentence, if you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. There's a play on the word firm. That word firm, in the Hebrew word firm, has the basic idea of standing firm. It can also have the nuance of standing firm in faith. So our translation has kind of spelled that out for us here. But we have this play on words, that he must believe in God. He must trust God. If he puts his faith in God, he will be okay. If he does not, he will not be okay. He will fall. He will face the consequences of not having faith. You see, he needs to be careful about his choices. And he doesn't need to worry, but he can be calm. He just has to have faith. And if he doesn't stand firm in faith, he won't stand firm at all in anything. In other words, it won't end well. Now, back around World War II times, the British government put out little posters that had a saying on it. And in the last few years, that saying has become kind of popular, along with many other variations of that saying. What is the saying? It's keep calm and carry on. All right? And you've seen these, you've probably seen bumper stickers and all these different things, but they keep calm and they add whatever it is that they're interested in. You might keep calm and ride your bike. Keep calm and drink wine. Keep calm and eat candy. Keep calm and pray. You could say, keep calm and have faith. But really, it's the other way around. It's have faith and keep calm. You see, when we have faith, God brings the calm. You've heard of it, the peace that passes all understanding. See, when you trust God, when you have faith, when you stand firm in faith, God brings the calm. He gives you peace. So if you are scared, have faith and keep calm. But what will Ahaz do? Let's continue reading. Verse 10. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask for a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. And he said, hear then, O house of David. No, let me stop there. Okay, so God is continuing to encourage Ahaz here. Maybe it's because he knows that Ahaz doesn't have faith, or that his faith is very small. Or he just knows that he's really scared and needs some encouragement. So he says, I've given you this promise, now ask for a sign, which means a confirming sign. And so sometimes when a prophecy was given that would not be fulfilled till a later time, they would give a sign as well that would confirm that that prophecy would be fulfilled. Okay? And so it could be a short-term prophecy, that this will happen in the near future, that when that happens, is that short-term prophecy is fulfilled, that you know that since God was able and did what he said, he will do the other one as well. So a confirming sign. So it could be that short-term prophecy, but sometimes the sign was something miraculous, and sometimes it was just something that would happen, that would take place in the near future. And when it does, it shows that God is sovereign and that God is all-knowing. He knows what's going to happen, and that because of all that, he can be believed, he can be trusted. So it's a confirming sign. So God tells Ahaz to ask for a sign. And he says, ask for any sign. He says, it can even be a huge miracle. He says, high as heaven, low as Sheol. In other words, something that is completely outside of the realm of human experience. He said, you can ask for anything. All you have to do is ask. But Ahaz refuses to ask. And when he does, he tries to sound like he's being pious, like he's super spiritual, like this is a good thing to refuse to ask God for a sign. He makes it sound like he has faith. Like, I don't need to ask, I already believe. He makes it sound like he has faith, and he doesn't need to ask for confirmation from God. His words even suggest that he's better than earlier generations who put God to the test. Specifically those in the wilderness. Remember that? When God had brought Israel out of Egypt and said, here's the land, I'm giving it to you, just go take it. And what did the people say? We can't. They put God to the test because they didn't believe him. They didn't trust him, and they didn't even think he was good. Because what they said? They said, it's impossible. And then they complained that God just brought them out there to kill them. The exact opposite of what God was doing. They had no faith. And by having no faith, that is how they put the Lord to the test. Which is ironic, because Ahaz has no faith. But he's saying, oh, I won't test the Lord. So he's putting on an act. He's like, I won't stoop so low as to test God by asking for a sign. Well, for one thing, God told him to ask. So it's not wrong to ask. Secondly, he really doesn't want to ask because he doesn't think he needs God's help. He's already got it taken care of. You see, 2 Kings 16 tells us that he's going to pay off the king of Assyria to come rescue him. And so Ahaz really has no faith in God. He's put his trust in a man to save him. So God offers Ahaz this sign in order to increase his faith, but Ahaz just isn't interested. Well, that was the wrong answer. And Isaiah responds to this complete lack of faith and disobedience in verse 13. Isaiah speaking, he says, and he said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Now, Ahaz isn't just trying Isaiah's patience. This is what he's saying right here. You're not just wearying men. You're not just trying my patience, but you're also trying the patience of God. And then notice this. He again addresses the king and his relatives as the house of David. Brings to mind all those things that we just talked about. But then he refers to God as what? My God, not your God. Oftentimes he said, why are you testing the Lord your God? Here he says, my God. You see, he's connecting this king and his relatives with their godly ancestor, with their faithful ancestor who was faithful to God. But this also suggests a disconnect between the current king and God. See, David's line has deteriorated spiritually. They appear at this point to have no real relationship with God. But God is still helping them because of his promise to David. So Ahaz didn't ask for a sign, but God will give him one anyways. Look at verse 14. It says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, at this point, we have to deal with some questions, because this is a very well-known verse, because it's quoted in Matthew. Very well-known verse. And most Christians who will read this in Isaiah and will think we've now changed subjects, and think that we've just now started talking about Jesus. And that's not entirely accurate. Now, it does somehow look forward to Jesus, and we know this because Matthew quotes this verse and says that it's fulfilled by Jesus' virgin birth. But as we read through Isaiah, we can tell there's something very different happening in the immediate context. And so the problem is that because of Matthew's statement, most people will read the New Testament idea that we get from Matthew back into, so New Testament revelation back into the Old Testament original context. without considering the original context. And so now this is a huge discussion. In fact, if you open up any commentary on Isaiah, they will have several pages on this. In fact, there are books written about this issue. And so for our purposes here today, I'm going to simplify. Actually, I'm going to oversimplify and this discussion, just to kind of give you an idea of what's happening here. So first of all, one of the big questions, or one of the big arguments, is based on the word that is translated virgin here in Isaiah. Now, almost every English translation translates this word as virgin, but a few of them don't. A few of them translate it as young woman, and that's actually a little more accurate. You see, the Hebrew word here broadly refers to a young woman of marriageable age. And so she could be a virgin, but might not be. She may be a virgin, but this word does not specify whether she is or not. But it allows for that possibility. But when Matthew quotes this verse, the Greek word that he uses specifies virgin. Why? Because Mary was actually a virgin. And so when he quotes this verse, he uses the Greek word that specifies virgin. So therefore, Bible readers and Bible translators have attached this idea back into the Isaiah context. Now, we shouldn't do that. In the original context, Isaiah doesn't specify virgin or not. Could be, but it doesn't specify. Now, here's another key issue is the name Emmanuel, which we know means God with us, or God is with us. Now, this name or this title we use for Jesus because Matthew applied it to Jesus by quoting this verse. And Jesus literally is God with us. And so when we read this verse in Isaiah, it sounds like he's talking about Jesus. But in the immediate context of Isaiah, it's pretty clear that Isaiah is talking about a child that is to be born in the time of Ahaz. So what's going on here? Well, Isaiah spoke of a young woman who would give birth to a child in the near future. Remember, it's a confirming sign. So something that hadn't need to happen soon. It's a confirming sign to Ahaz about God being with his people, with the people of Judah, and protecting Jerusalem from those allied forces of Israel and Syria. Then Matthew, let me go from your perspective. Later, Matthew, he, under the inspiration of God, understood that situation in Isaiah's time as a type or a foreshadowing of Jesus who was to come later. It's kind of like Matthew also quoted Hosea when he said, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." And we talked about that when we talked about Hosea, that Jesus, he did come out of Egypt, and he was God's perfect son. But when he was in the original quotation, it was talking about the people of Israel coming out of Egypt. Okay? So Matthew is doing the same type of thing. He sees a foreshadowing or a type of Jesus in the original situation. Now, there's several connections that bring these things together, that bring out this significance to the prophecy. First of all, in Isaiah's time, there is a young woman who could, and this word could refer to a virgin. And then you have Mary, who actually was a virgin when she miraculously conceived and gave birth to Jesus. Secondly, you have a conception that is foretold by Isaiah, and then a conception that is foretold by an angel. Thirdly, in both, you have a son being born. And fourth, then you have this boy being named Emmanuel to make the point that God is with his people. And then you have Jesus being born, who is literally God with us. So we call him Emmanuel, but really we're doing that Matthew's leading. So in the original context, it does not appear to be, at least on the surface, a messianic prophecy. But with further revelation and under the inspiration from the Holy Spirit, Matthew sees it as foreshadowing the birth of Jesus, our Emmanuel. All right? If you still have questions, talk to me later. But now we can get back to the passage. So, who is the young woman Isaiah is talking about here? We are actually not told exactly. Now, there are some clues and things, but we are not told exactly. But he says, the young woman, or this could be translated, this young woman, which suggests that it may even be someone who's standing there. He's talking of a specific young lady. The young woman will conceive. And there are several suggestions for these. And the best two suggestions was that it's either someone in the royal family, possibly one of Ahaz's wives, or Isaiah's own wife. So, let's keep reading then. Verse 15. He shall eat, so he's talking about Emmanuel, the boy Emmanuel who will be born. Verse 15, he shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. So, some of the things in these verses are positive, and some of these things are negative. And there's a couple statements that you read and you say, well, that could go either way. So first, there's the good news. Israel and Syria will not be a threat. They're going to be wiped out. Secondly, he says that the boy Emmanuel will eat curds and honey and learn right and wrong. Now, is this eating curds and honey? Is this referring to a time of settled prosperity, like a land flowing with milk and honey? Or is this referring to a time of nomadic hardship where you don't have a specific home, you travel around and things are difficult? In other words, sour milk, curds, sour milk, and wild honey, whatever you can find. And so, third thing, the days will come, he says, days will come that are unlike any since Israel divided into the two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Are these good days or are these bad days? Well, he gives us the answer in this one little phrase. The king of Assyria. In other words, bad. Okay? Because the following verses will make this clear. The king that Ahaz is putting his hope and his trust in is going to turn on him. And the boy Emmanuel, he will learn to trust God and to listen to God because things will be so bad because of Ahaz's evil choices. So we have this mixture of blessing and judgment. The sign was confirming God's protection of Jerusalem, but in the end, it ends up also predicting judgment as a result of Ahaz's refusing to trust God. So God will be with them, but he will be with them both in blessing, in protection, and in judgment. You see, Ahaz tried to fool God. And you can't fool God, right? I mean, he knows if you're putting on an act. He knows if you're just acting religious or pretending to be faithful. He knows your hidden intentions, the thoughts of your hearts. He knows your hidden sins and your hidden attitudes and your hidden choices. Simply put, don't play games with God. Just be faithful and live by faith. Because without faith, things don't end well. Look at verse 18. In that day, the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the end of the streams of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they will all come and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rocks and on the thorn bushes and on all the pastures. Now, this is a picture God is bringing judgment to discipline his people, specifically to discipline the house of David. And both Egypt and Assyria will come against Judah at God's leading. Verse 20. He says, in that day the Lord will shave with a razor that is hired beyond the river with the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet, and it will sweep away the beard also. Okay, so there's a picture going on here. And this pictures the Assyrian king as a foreign barber who is hired to come and to shave all the hair off the people of Judah. And this shaving of the people could refer to them being made slaves when they are attacked and taken into exile. Or it could just be a picture of their humiliation, that some foreigner is going to come and shave all their hair. Because if you remember in their culture, if you shaved off even someone's beard, that was a great humiliation. But they're shaving everything. And so it could just be a picture of humiliation at the hands of this foreigner. But the ironic thing is that he was hired. Ahaz has invited him to come down and humiliate them. Verse 21. It says, in that day a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. And because of the abundance of milk they give, he will eat curds. For everyone who is left in the land will eat curds and honey. In that day, every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. With bow and arrows a man will come there, for all the land will be briars and thorns. And as for all the hills that used to be hoed with a hoe, you will not come there for fear of briars and thorns. But they will become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. All right, there's a lot of imagery there, but this is saying that there's going to be a time of scarcity. This is the opposite of prosperity and blessing. And a man's entire herd of animals is going to be comprised of 1 cow and 2 sheep. In other words, not very much. And he will work to keep those alive so they can provide milk for him. And it says that people will eat curds or sour milk and wild honey, whatever they can find. And the land will be wild. It'll be overgrown where there used to be cultivated farmland. There won't be any more productive vineyards. And people will have to hunt with bow and arrow in order to find food rather than growing crops. In other words, their successful civilization and their cities will be no more. It'll be a place of ruin because of the lack of faith, because they didn't listen to God, because they didn't obey or follow God. Now, if God has told you something, believe it. We've been given many promises. Listen to God. Trust him. And be encouraged by those promises. That we don't have to worry or fear, but we have good promises and a God we can trust. Now, sometimes we may have doubts. Sometimes we may get scared. Sometimes we may be tempted to put our trust in someone or something else other than God. But remember who your God is. And remember that he's got you. Now, if you need some confirmation, you've got it. Is he able to save you? Is he able to care for you? Absolutely. I mean, just look at what God has done throughout human history. I mean, we can read in his word what he has done. We can also look at just history and see where God is moving. And even today, where God is moving and how he takes care of his people. We can also look at creation. I mean, just look around you. Go to the mountains, the beach, wherever it is. You look around you and you see just a glimpse of the power of our God. He is able. He is absolutely able. But is he faithful? Absolutely. Again, we can read all that God has done throughout history, how he has promised and kept his promises, how he has been faithful to his people, how he faithfully sent Jesus to save us. He is faithful. We can also, again, look at creation and the faithfulness of God. We see a glimpse of God's faithfulness in the fact that the sun raises every morning. That things aren't just totally falling apart. So he's faithful. Is he with us? Absolutely. In Hebrews, God said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. That's a promise. And he is able and he is faithful to keep that promise. He says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He is with us. And we also have the Holy Spirit, who Paul tells us in Romans that the Spirit bears witness to our spirit, that we belong to him, that we are children of God. He is with us. And last question, does he love us? Absolutely. How do we know? Well, he demonstrated his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You see, when we were sinners, he sent Jesus to die for people who were opposed to him, who were sinning against him. Even then, when we were against him, God sent Jesus to be our Savior, so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be made right with God and have a relationship with him and live with him for eternity. That is love. And God's word says, perfect love casts out all fear. We know he loves us. We know that he is with us. We know that he is faithful. We know that he is able. When you are scared, turn to him. Lean on him. Stand firm in faith. Don't worry. Trust the Lord.